This morning we have Dorsey Hopson, the superintendent of Shelby County Schools, with us. Dorsey, I remember the night you got this job. Dorsey was the school board's lawyer. And you may remember this is when the two districts were consolidating. It had two superintendents. It had Kreiner Cash in the city and John Aiken in the county. We only needed one superintendent, and it was very unclear how it was going to shake out. I think the board was ready to hire a national consultant, and then I can only imagine that they looked around to the man who'd been giving them advice for about 2 years, and they gave Dorsey Hopson the job. That was 6 years ago. Most superintendents stay about 4.5 years because it is such a difficult job. So I'm going to ask Dorsey a few questions, and then we will open it up to the floor, okay? Dorsey, we're going to have to share a microphone. My first question is, well, first I want to say to you, I happened to be at the Tigers game last night and saw the Memphis Tigers play Yale. There was a lot of talk around me about brawn versus brains. And oh, can you not hear? No. Oh. Oh, okay. Anyway, Dorsey, I just can only imagine what it feels to have so much of that talent came through your system.
Yeah, Jan, let me just first of all thank you for inviting me. You guys have to know you have an extraordinary minister of communication. I mean, I've known her for a long time, just a heart of gold, a heart for God, a heart for the city, so I appreciate you inviting me. I'm glad to be here. And I'm Dorsey Hopson. I'm a Memphis kid, grew up in Whitehaven, went to Whitehaven high school, went to the University of Memphis for undergraduate, and then I went to Georgia State University for law school. And I think to your point, Jane, just the talent here, whether we're talking about any industry, and particularly basketball, is extraordinary. Glad to have my good friend Penny Hardaway as the coach there, and I think you're going to see some very exciting things, not just with the University of Memphis basketball program, but I think just in general in Memphis, because we've got a lot of positive momentum going, a lot of synergy, a lot of alignment and things, particularly in education, and I think our best days are ahead.
Nice to hear. Okay, Dorsey, ready to start? I want to just open with you telling us about your work and what it is like to be the superintendent in a district where I think more than half of the children live in poverty.
Well, it's tough. I think, one of the things that I learned when I first started doing this work that really blew me away is when you look at our student body, we have approximately about 105,000 kids, but 40,000 of those students live in households where the income is less than $10,000 a year. So I'm gonna let that sink in. 40,000 kids, households where the income is less than $10,000 a year. And when you really look at that, you start to think about, so how does a family live on sometimes 4, 5, 6 people on $200 a week? And just quick story, when I first got back to Memphis, to kind of crystallize this for you, I was a lawyer, so I was going to interview some witnesses for a case. So I go over to North Memphis to interview a student, and I pull up, and I call my assistant because I think that I'm in the wrong place because literally the stairs are falling down, the house is boarded up. And so as I get ready to leave, somebody says, no, come in. So I come inside, and there are literally 6 or 7 mattresses on the floor, squalor, a bunch of fans plugged up. And I'm like, this is where our kids live. This is what $10,000 a year and multiple people in the house look like. And I tell that story because I really, to my core, believe that education is the great equalizer, right? You can't choose the circumstances in life that you're born in, but you can choose to use the education system to change your circumstance in life, which is why I think the work is so important, because for many of these kids, their last best chance is for us to make sure that we do our absolute very best for them every day and create a system that they can use to turn their life around. So that's what I get up most days thinking about, and that's what really drives the work. But when you have such poverty, out of poverty, you have a high illiteracy rate, high teen pregnancy, a lot of symptoms of poverty, and then those symptoms come to school, so it just becomes extraordinarily difficult for many of our students to get some of the student outcomes that we want them to have. And I met a lot of you guys. I know a lot of you are teachers and have been in the schools. You all know, firsthand that, while poverty is never an excuse, it is a reality and creates a challenge that we have to make sure we're acutely aware and plan for and put safety nets in for these kids to make sure that they have the best opportunity to succeed.
Speaking of safety nets, I remember when you instituted school lunch and school breakfast and supper at some schools. Free school lunches, free breakfast. Everybody in Shelby County schools gets free breakfast, free lunch, and some kids get free evening meals, part of the safety net. Do you know the participation in that?
Yeah, so it's about 80% of our students around the lunch and the breakfast, and the reason, couple reasons, we had a free and reduced lunch program, but there was always, or we heard, a stigma around, some kid walks up and pays $2 and some kid pulls out the lunch card, and it was almost a disincentive for kids to eat. And what we know is that for many of our kids, their best 2 meals are going to be breakfast and lunch, at school. So the federal government had a program called Community Eligibility, and I think if like 70% of your students are free and reduced lunch, which I think 90% of our students are, then we could move towards that. So that was something that we were glad that we could do, because again, our participation in terms of students that actually eat lunch and breakfast is going way up now that we had a community eligibility.
So when I was thinking about what to ask Dorsey, I just think how confusing the headlines are if you don't know some basic stuff that happens in the school district, including that we now have lots of charter schools, and we have this state-run school district in Memphis and across the state, but it has most of its holdings in Memphis. It's called the Achievement School District. It happened by act of the state legislature about 6 or 7 years ago. The nickname, its acronym is ASD. I'm going to have Dorsey just explain a little bit about the ASD and where we are now. Initially, schools would have 5 years to be in the ASD. The state would take over low-performing schools in Memphis, turn them around, they said, in 5 years, and return them to Dorsey and the school board. And mostly they did that by turning them into charter schools. So can you bring us up to date on the ASD?
So I guess about 5 years ago, there was a grant, or a competitive grant, that was issued to 2 states, Tennessee and I think Connecticut. And essentially what the grant said was, we're going to fund you if you can come up with innovative ways to turn around poor performing schools. And so out of that came the ASD and what we call the iZone, which is our in-house model of turnaround schools. So just for some context, when the list was first run in 2012, I think we had about 85 or so bottom 5% schools throughout the state. And 67 of those schools were in the Memphis City schools at the time. So the state put together its strategy, the ASD, where they came in and could take over any schools that are in the bottom 5%. And we also had an in-house model where we did the same thing. And happy to say that, 6 years later, we've reduced the number of schools in the priority list from 67 to I think now it's like 23 in Shelby County. Now the ASD, their strategy has been basically to recruit charter schools and have those charter schools educate those kids. And it's been a mixed bag, right? I mean, I'll just be honest, I'm in church, so I'll be honest, So we, the ASD strategy, it hasn't been nearly as successful as they had hoped it would be. Our iZone, on the other hand, which again is our in-house model, has been really recognized as one of the national models for turning around schools. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think the big learning for me is as we talked about the poverty, like there's a lot of focus on instruction and teaching and learning, but I think that there needs to also be a focus on the social and emotional needs of these kids. Because again, if you're hungry or you had to get up in the middle of the night and leave because your mom got evicted, or a host of things that our kids deal with, you can't just assume they're going to show up to school ready to learn. And I think the landscape is very different too. We are, in addition to I think 26 or so charter schools in the ASD, the Shelby County Schools has authorized about 60 charters. So all in, there are probably 85 or so charters in Memphis, and then another probably 170 schools that are district run. And I know we'll talk about it, Jane, but the reality is that that's just far too many schools, right? Like we don't have enough students to be operating all these buildings. So then what happens is you have all these facilities and they're half utilized and people are just not being efficient. So that's really the landscape. Mixed bag in terms of, like, we have some very high performing charter schools that are some of the best schools in the state, but we also have some very low performing charter schools that are actually on the priority list. So there's a huge range of how schools are doing, just like the schools that we operate.
Dorsey, just because we have you here, can you help us with some of the terminology? Let's start with charter schools. Public schools?
Yes, so charter schools obviously are public schools, and what happens is it's almost like you contract with the district to operate a school. And so if Jane and I were to decide that we want a charter school, we'd go through the process and apply. And if we were accepted, then all the dollars for the kids that come to your school that would traditionally go to the district would just go directly to the charter school. And the advantages of the charter school obviously are you have more flexibility, you can be more nimble, you have more autonomy. You don't have to do or use all the strategies that the district uses, which is good in many respects, because we know that the needs of a kid in, say, Orange Mound may be different in South Memphis or Westwood or East Memphis. So oftentimes with school districts, there tends to be kind of a, I don't want to say canned approach, but a more an approach where people kind of say this is the strategy, and we're going to just implement it. But charter schools do have that flexibility. On the other hand, charter schools, what we're finding is they have a tough time with some of the funding, particularly when it comes to kids with special needs. If we're the Shelby County Schools, we have a whole department that focuses on and supports kids with special needs. But if you're at a charter school, you have your funding and you have to make it work with the funding. So again, I think that when you look at the data and some of the results, we have some very high performing charter schools and we need to try to learn from them, but then we also have some charters that struggle.
Dorsey, I have lost track a little bit of how much the school district gets per pupil in taxpayer funds.
So we get about $8,200 per child, and probably about 45% of that comes from the Shelby County Commission, and the other 65, or the other portion of it comes from the state of Tennessee. And then we also have, we get federal dollars, probably around $100 million or so, and it's earmarked, obviously, for economically disadvantaged kids. So our per pupil fund is about $8,200, but then for some kids that receive the Title I funding, it's probably close to about $10,000 a kid.
So the charter schools would be able to take that $10,000 and determine how they want to spend it. They can do what they want with their faculty funding. So for instance, Dorsey is required to have a librarian and a school counselor for every so many hundred children. A charter school may not have to do that. They may decide that they want more math coaches on the payroll. So that is an example of how they have a little bit more freedom from the rules that the traditional public schools have to follow. They also can have a longer school day. They can pay their teachers more or less. So it's really sort of an entrepreneurialism in public education. And it's been going on in Memphis probably about 10 years now. I think the law happened in 2000. So we have this great proliferation of charter schools. Did you say 85 charter schools? It's some of them the school board controls, some of them the ASD controls. Now, one of the things we've seen is that maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, there was this great resurgence and focus on Memphis. People from all over wanted to run charter schools in Memphis because they thought that the state laws were going to be more lenient, that they were going to have more freedom, and that the leadership in the state was really sort of pro-charter. So a lot of these nationally recognized charter schools came to Memphis and set up shop. And Aspire was one of them. I see now that it's very possible Aspire may close its schools and leave town. What's going on?
Yeah, so you're dead on, Jan. I think that 2012, when that law we talked about passed, and there was a lot of external and internal philanthropy that really put forth a lot of dollars to support charter schools and recruit charter schools. But I think now, 6 years later, the results have not been anywhere near what people expected. And so I think it's caused a lot of that external financial support, to kind of go away. And I think Aspire is a great example. Aspire runs a very successful charter network out of California. And so they've been here for 6 years with mixed results. And what I understand is that they lost a lot of local and national funding. And so now they're grappling with some of the same things that all schools have to grapple with: outdated facilities, trying to attract the right talent. And I think without that external funding, it just has an impact. I think there's an organization called Green Dot. They're another California charter network that I think is kind of struggling with some of the same things.
And these schools took over some just historic Memphis schools. Green Dot took over Fairleigh High School, and Aspire took over some of the schools in Orange Mound. So are you poised to get those schools back?
Well, interestingly, so the statute, the whole theory was we're going to take these schools and move them from the bottom 5% and get them to the top 25% in 5 years, and then we're going to give them back to you guys. But the reality is that many of those schools are doing worse than they were 5 years ago. So we've been talking with the state about, so what does it look like to have the schools come back? So part of it is I think they still want more time to make the improvements that they wanted to make. And I think also, we have limited resources too, so, if the state has a bag of resources and we have a bag of resources, if you're truly working as partners, then, the conditions are such that we'd like to see them move the schools, or return them in better shape than they were. With ESSA, which is the new state law that governs some of these issues, I think we have another year or so to figure out a written plan on how those schools will come back and what that looks like.
So the dilemma for the superintendent and the school board was when all of these schools left to join the ASD or to become charter schools, the school board lost that $8,000 per student for every child in those schools. There was some good that came of it too. These schools said, well, we're going to come in and we think we can really help these children. we can do a better job than what they've had before. That was what they were saying. But the overall effect was that it took so many children out of school buildings, but it didn't take them all. So Dorsey and the school board were left to try to run schools now that are based on an enrollment of maybe 300, 400 children with maybe half that. And they still had to repair the roof, and they still had to wax the gym floor, and they still had to pay faculty. They still had to have a librarian, even though they may not have had 450 children, they still had to have one school librarian. So it really, it was sort of a funding dilemma. And then all of a sudden you had all kinds of schools that were maybe half full because all these other schools had started up. So I think you can understand, and maybe what you see in the media now will make a little bit more sense about what was happening and what the managerial challenges were. You talked a little bit about the students who concern you the most. Can you give us a profile of the student you think about every day? And I remember one time on the first day of school, being on a tour with you, and we walked by some housing that was just was really horrible. And I remember I was standing by Dorsey, and he said, "My gosh, why do people have to live this way?" Anyway, tell us about the boy or the girl you think about.
Yeah, I think you're dead on again, Jen. I think about being in a grocery store and speaking with an 8th grade student, and her telling me how great of a job she's doing, how much she enjoyed school, but she was concerned because she couldn't do some after-school activity. And I'm like, well, why can't you do it? She said, well, I have to go home, and I've got my niece and my nephew and my 2 brothers. I have to watch them. I have to be at home at 3 o'clock. And basically now, as a 8th grader, because my grandmom, who we live with, has 2 jobs. And so I think about those kinds of students who are just really living in generational suffocating poverty. Because at the end of the day, I know I'm extraordinarily blessed, right? I mean, I'll say, and I'll just share, I'm single mom, dad, was addicted to drugs as I was growing up. And so I saw the other side of the poverty piece too. Like, mom had several jobs, and now, the grace of God, other side. But I know that the reality is that there are so many kids who are just figuring out what the next day is going to look like. Where am I going to get my next meal from? And it's hard to focus on algebra or your reading, when, and I'll just a quick example. So I'm reading, one of the things that I do is when kids get suspended, they can ultimately depend on the suspension, appeal the suspension to me. And so I'm reading this, maybe a 9-year-old, 10-year-old has they'd suspend him for the whole year because he picked up a pencil and charged toward the teacher and told her he was going to kill her. And I'm saying to myself, like, how does a 10-year-old, I've got a 9-year-old, 11-year-old, how does a 10-year-old get to that point? But then as you read the file, when the child was 7, his mom was holding him, and mom's boyfriend stabs mom, kills mom while holding the child, cuts the child, at 7, and he watches his mom die. So the child, I'm sure, hadn't had any type of psychological counseling and stuff like that. So when you are dealing with that, it's just hard to have the ideal conditions for student learning. And what we know clearly, like I think about my kids and so many kids who, are not in poverty, the expectation is you come to school ready to learn. So if you come to school ready to learn, our teachers are great, our school leaders are great, we're gonna get you where you need to be. But if you are just coming to school looking for a safe place, or, dealing with all these kinds of things that we can't even really imagine, then, that is the type of student, and unfortunately, it's far too many of those kids. And that's an extreme example I cited, but there are all kinds of bits and pieces of things that our kids have to go through every single day before they get to the table ready to learn. So, when you have so many kids with so many needs, our Memphis is great, but we've got a lot of pockets of extreme poverty, and trying to deal with all that, like, those are the kinds of kids that we worry about. And I think that some of the data points are, obviously, Literacy is the gateway to everything. I mean, if you can't read, you're not going to be successful. And then we have all these indicators around, like third grade reading is the first indicator. Like you learn how to read up to the third grade, then you read to learn after the third grade. So if you don't learn how to read, you're going to always be struggling. We only have about 35% of our third graders reading on grade level. And there's a whole list of horribles that goes along with not being able to read on third grade, by third grade. So that means 65+% of our kids are tracking towards not something good, right? So like thinking about how do you put the supports in to make sure kids have a phonemic awareness and the fluency and all those, the coding and all those things that you need to do to learn how to read, while also addressing those social and emotional needs, because we know that every year you're behind, it's twice as hard to catch up. And then you think about, like, in our toughest schools, where we need the most support, it's oftentimes the most difficult to get the strongest teachers, you know, for a number of reasons. So, you know, just thinking about our kids who are living in extreme poverty is really what, you know, kind of keeps me up at night as we think about educational strategies.
This is always interesting to me. At this time of the year, people in government agencies are thinking about what their legislative priorities will be for the coming session. Can you give us some of the things that you're thinking about that are easy for us to understand, so we sort of know what's on your mind this time of year?
No, I think just thing 1, 2, and 3 is more funding, especially from the state. I mean, I think that, you know, our state, you know, is way down the list in terms of funding for education when you look at all 50 states. In fact, and I think we are, and Chattanooga and Nashville are suing the state for more funding. And the theory is that they have have done a lot better in terms of pushing the bar in terms of what they expect, but it really becomes a bunch of unfunded mandates. And, you know, while we recognize obviously that, you know, when the economy's tough, I mean, you have to make priority choices. I think we have about a $2 billion surplus in the state now. So I think funding is, you know, thing 1, 2, and 3. I think some more laws and regulations around charter schools and how they operate and how they don't operate, and facilities and all those things need to be discussed, because when they started the charter school law 12 years ago, it was a good concept and a great idea. And so now 12 years later, we have, you know, again, 80 here and throughout the state, probably 100, and the rules and regulations are probably not robust enough to govern the number of schools we have now. And I think there's been a lot of discussion around, you know, more flexibility for teachers, particularly, you know, like, you know, some of our licensure requirements and the way we license teachers are very strenuous and oftentimes work against us. Some of the credentials that teachers have to do certain subjects, you know, oftentimes, you know, hurt. So those probably be the three big areas that we'll be pushing for in January.
Dorsey, I know also at this time of the year you're surveying the district to see where you've had growth and movement, and it often means that there is a list that Dorsey will present to the board about schools that he would like to see closed. And that always creates a big furor, because if the school is the anchor in your neighborhood, and that is often the case, you hate to see that building closed. I doubt you can name names now, but will there be closures? Are you going to recommend closures?
Yeah, I think, you know, that is probably the most difficult thing that I've had to do in my 6 years, is close schools for those very reasons. Because oftentimes I think about a Carver High School and a Northside High School, schools that have so much history and mean so much to communities, but don't have any kids in them. You know, our running joke with, you know, my colleagues across the country, you know, is, you know, what do you call a superintendent that closes schools? A former superintendent. So we hate to do that because it generates so much passion and so much emotion. But at the end of the day, you know, you have to be efficient. And I'll share with you all, I think that, you know, we're working on a plan now to really right-size the district. And I think that, I mean, in all candor, there probably are 50 or 60 schools that need to be closed. Now, there need to be some new schools built. You know, you may take 50 and, you know, build 12 more. You know, I mean, for example, we did that very thing. And you were around, Janet, West Haven Elementary is out in Whitehaven. There were literally 3 schools that were about a half a mile from each other, and all of them were in bad shape. All of them were on the priority list, and all of them underutilized. And so we closed them all. I mean, it was a tough period. And then we rebuilt one. We put all 3 of those kids in a brand new facility, and now that school has been open for 2 years. Both years it's been on the state's rewards list for one of the top schools in the state. So, like, you know, you can't just say let's just close them, because it does rip the heart out of some communities, but you have to also say, all right, well, let's close and consolidate and build something new. Certainly my good friend John Atkins out in Collierville has it right. I don't know if you all have been out to the Collierville High School, but it's a reminder that learning environments matter, right? So I applaud him, and I think that he's doing great work out there. But, you know, 30 miles south, you know, or west, you got schools that are literally floors are buckling and roofs are falling in. So I think the way to do that is to be smart about saying, you know, let's look at what the real need is. I mean, by rule of thumb, you know, you look at efficient districts. If you got, you know, 10,000, or maybe like on average, you say like 1,000 kids per school. That's just kind of, so yeah, just if you look at all the schools, just think about how many schools do you need. If I got 50,000 kids, I probably need 50 schools, and the configuration could be different. So we have 105,000 kids in 270 facilities. That's just too many facilities, and when you're trying to operate them all, given their condition, given the fact that for 10 years there was no capital investments made, so you're not gonna have your house and do nothing with it for 10 years. Otherwise, you're gonna have some serious issues 10 years later. So we've got a lot of buildings like that. So we probably need to be really aggressive about closing a lot of schools, with building some schools, and try to get the footprint right.
That seems like never-ending work. And every time Dorsey presents one of these lists to the school board about schools that he thinks could be improved if they were closed and the children were moved to another building, the school auditorium where the board meets fills up with people who are emotional and angry and sure that they have not been heard. I saw you one time make a compromise about some schools that were going to close, even besides the one you talked about. There was another where you said, well, you know what, we will not vote tonight, we're going to listen. And I think what you decided to do was build another school, and yeah. It's hard to listen to an angry crowd because they're very emotional. They may not be working on a good set of facts, but I think it helps the longevity of the leader if you can listen to the people. At least they know they've been heard. So one of the things that's a big part of Dorsey's life is how you're going to pay teachers and how you're going to pay them equitably. And I understand that there is some work to renegotiate the contract now. Several years ago, the Tennessee legislature passed this series of laws that said that teachers would no longer have collective bargaining, that they would bargain in something that's sort of collaborative conferencing, which is really a meaningless term unless you're on the inside. So in this next question, Dorsey, this is going to be a big one. Can you tell us why it doesn't necessarily make sense to pay your most senior teachers the most money? Why it's not necessarily the most sensible thing to have a pay scale where every year you get a bump, and what the research shows about that?
Well, my mother, who taught for 20 plus years, would probably smack me on the head in response to that. But I just think, again, I mean, I think in my judgment, you should incentivize and reward your best teachers the best. I mean, I think that we have 6,000 teachers, and we have some extraordinary teachers. But all teachers, like all barbers or lawyers or whatever, are not the same. And I think at the end of the day, in conversations I've had with teachers, that and teachers know, like, you could be a rock star teacher and a couple, doors down, maybe your colleague is not as committed or whatever as you are. I think it's fundamentally unfair for, those two folks to just get the same thing for showing up. I think that what we know is that a great teacher can move a kid 2 or 3 years worth of growth in a year, sometimes 3 and 4 years worth of growth. But a poor performing teacher can hold a kid back, can push a kid back for 2 years. So I think we have to have, a system that is data driven and objective to really be able to demonstrate, what's effective and what's not. Now, I think the concern, rightfully so, is that some of the measures we've been using right now may not necessarily be the best measures. And if I'm a teacher, as I think for most teachers I talk to, they'll say, look, I'm not afraid to, if you're going to truly create a system to incentivize me, and it's fair and objective, because I know I'm good, I don't have a problem with it, but there's just so many things under the hood that can't be validated. Like, for example, we moved to a compensation or performance-based compensation system a couple years ago, and it's basically based on your evaluation for the year. And well, the evaluation is twofold. It's what happens in the classroom when people come in and observe you. And I mean, people are human, so you catch your principal on a bad day, it may be lower, or you have a good relationship with your so those things impact, and then also the test scores. So, we've had a debacle with test scores for the last 2 or 3 years. So I think that the system we have right now, certainly should cause pause, which is why we moved away from even the system we implemented with all the changes going on. But if there's a way to say, we're going to be able to identify the true rock stars. It's not about, I think you have to have a system in place where, all teachers, because if you're working, then we're assuming you're being effective. So everybody should be honored and rewarded like the professionals that they are. But I think if you're extraordinary, then you should have an opportunity to, receive extraordinary compensation. And you can't really just do that with a lockstep, every year, regardless of outcomes, regardless of, efficacy. Everybody gets the same thing. I mean, and I know that's one of the things, the strategies that charter schools do. So we're gonna, you do these, you create these multiple measures to evaluate you, and then, look at all these different objective measures to see, are there things that distinguish you, and if they do, whether it's a bonus structure or, more in terms of your pay or whatever, what I've seen and what I've learned is that people usually respond, not just in schools, but to incentives. And I mean, it's worked for a long time in a lot of different industries.
A few years ago, the state also, there was a time a few years ago when Tennessee instigated a lot of education reform and made it stick by making it law. And one of the things was that teachers would be rated on a 1 to 5 scale. And a large percentage of that was how well their students did on their test scores. And then, as Dorsey mentioned, the classroom observation, which would be done by a trained person, usually the building principal or some other leader in the school. Well, it is conceivable that you can be an excellent educator and not have good test scores for some of the reasons that Dorsey has mentioned. You can be in a high poverty school where the children are under a great deal of stress. So I know when I was following you, you were hoping to institute this merit-based system. I don't think you have been able to.
We actually did 2 years ago, and essentially what happened was, your raise was based on, your evaluation score. So like, just throwing numbers out there, it may be that all teachers would get $1,000 raise every year under the step and lane systems. Then it may say, all right, well, no, If you're level 3, you get an $800 raise. If you're level 4, you get a $1,200. If you're level 5, you get a $1,500. But what's interesting, even with that system, there's a lot of pushback on that. But our ratings were so skewed that it actually ended up being a better deal for 80% of the teachers, because I think we have, and I mean, you guys read the papers and stuff. So even with some of our achievement scores being low. We had 80% of our teachers are rated level 4 and 5. So that means we're saying 80% of our teachers are exceeding expectation, and then another 15% or 16% were meeting expectation. So under our scale, only 4% of our teachers, weren't meeting expectations. But you have 90% of your kids not proficient. And I know there's a lot in that, but I mean, I think that's why I think that, because the way the data is looked at, and because of all those external factors, it's hard to get an accurate clip. But and for teachers in here, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware, but teachers know who the rock star teachers are. Like, there's no, I'm like there. You go into school and you ask a principal, I want to go observe your, best teacher in this, best teacher in that, or you ask teachers, who's your best teacher? Like, people know who it is, and then when you go in, like, there's such a great difference between when you see a truly rock star teacher, which we have a lot of, you know it. So there's got to be, again, other ways to measure just in how kids do on the test.
One of the challenges, if you're the superintendent of a school district like this, and maybe any school district, is that there are schools where everybody wants to teach. White Station is one of them. So White Station tends to have a very senior faculty because people get there and they stay. It's hard to teach in Orange Mound for a variety of reasons. So Dorsey, can you talk about some of the things that have helped you get people to go to schools that are struggling?
Well, the main thing, obviously, is additional compensation. So we, in our I-Zone schools, and just some of our other hard-to-staff schools, we just offer, sign-on and longevity bonuses. Again, it goes to, like, just when you really think about the fairness of a one-size-fits-all compensation system. I mean, just the reality is, if my kids go to Idlewild and Maxine Smith, they're not going to be dealing with a lot of disciplinary issues over there. They're just not. But on the other hand, at Westwood Elementary or Hamilton Elementary, the learning environment is much different, because teachers have to now differentiate instruction and do a whole lot more remediation, and it's a different scenario. So when you have those two different scenarios, it just seems like there should be some extra incentive to get your best people to stay. Again, White Station is a great example. They will never have a bunch of vacancies there, but Tresvant, we can't find a math teacher. So, I mean, the financial piece is always good. The offering teachers different leadership pathways so they can stay in school, whether it's, you get to be the coach on this or the lead on that, and we pay you to do that. But I think also it's just got to be a calling to do that work, because it's just, I heard somebody say the other day that it's not just hard work. It's not just hard work. It's hard work to be, in those trenches every single day. And I'm just glad that we have a lot of folks who are committed to it.
One of the things that we can see in this district is we have a lot of young teachers who maybe have 1 or 2 years experience. I think you have more of that than surrounding districts. So we know that teachers get better the longer they teach, up to a certain point. I mean, we all get better as we do things. First and second year teachers, the research shows, aren't generally as effective as someone who's been in the classroom 4 or 5 or 6 years. So can you tell us what you're trying to do? I'm sure that's an incentive issue, again, to get more of these young teachers mixed in with seasoned people and not have all the young teachers at 10 or 15 schools, which is hard on those children.
I think you're right, Jane. Just, again, back to those incentives, but then also designing long-term professional development plans to support teachers. Because what we hear in exit interviews is, has shown. Yeah, we hear from some of our teachers who leave after 1 or 2 years that, they showed up, they're excited about it, but then there's just no support, or real formalized support or ongoing professional development so that they feel supported, so that they can continue to get better. Because, a young man shared a story with me about, hey, I show up, I get to my classroom, I'm all excited, I'm decorate my room, I got all my strategies I've learned in college, and then the kids show up, and, I talked to the principal, he's got 30 other teachers and all this stuff, and just didn't have time to really, groom him. So from a central office standpoint, putting together really a thoughtful, multi-year system to support teachers in a differentiated way. And then obviously, again, the financial incentive, what we found more is like, if you stay, for 4 years, here's what you get as a bonus, or 3 years, here's what you get as a bonus. And but it also speaks to, this is one of the, this is some of the impacts of having too many buildings too. Because if you didn't have, if we didn't have that 60 or 70 extra buildings, you wouldn't have to necessarily be stretching to get people in these roles who may not necessarily want to do them or be prepared for them, or you could be more focused on how you support teachers. You have more resources to do a lot of things. So, a lot of our challenges go back to those buildings.
Our congregation is involved with Team Read. We work at Shady Grove during the school day and at the Emmanuel After School Center downtown. We have some really committed people here who go twice a week. I wonder, what else could we do?
Pray. No, but I think that Team Read is really a great program, and it allows people to get really engaged in a meaningful and strategic way. I would say, just off the top of my head, if you guys would just, either collectively or individually, 2 things. Go visit a school in a really tough neighborhood, right? And spend 30 or 45 minutes visiting classrooms, and so you just really get the feel of that. And then just adopt a teacher. And by that I mean, whether it's as a congregation or just individually, identify somebody to be just a support system to, and however they think that you need support. Because oftentimes it's, hey, I need, 4 or 5 reams of paper because my kids don't have their stuff, or they just need somebody to talk to, or different things. And I've asked people to do that, and I've had so many people to reach out to teachers and just form relationships, and it just will open your eyes really in a whole different way.
That sounds pretty manageable, doesn't it? But a couple more things before we ask for questions from the floor. The average superintendent stays about 4.5 years. Dorsey has been on the job for 6 years. Why have you stayed?
It's actually 3.5 for Urban. I just think this, I again feel extraordinarily blessed. God works in mysterious ways that sometimes, makes you chuckle, because I'm a trial lawyer, and, to even be in this role, I think that, given the time and what happened, I think that, it's not by accident, and this is where he wanted me to be for this point in time. And I think just the motivation of knowing how impactful the work is and being so blessed to be able to influence the work has been a motivator. And I think because I'm from Memphis, people let me, get away with or have real conversations that need to be had that perhaps somebody who's not from here can have. But 6 years is a long time, and it certainly wears on you. It wears on your family. I joke with my kids, like I don't get to be off if we're in the grocery store and, you know, somebody wanted to tell me something about what happened. So it's become, it's a lot, but, you know, I think that the last 6 years have been the most rewarding professional experience I've ever had, and, you know, I'll continue to be prayerful about, you know, when God will release me from this position.
Just for your information, Dorsey was nominated for the Superintendent of the Year award by the Council of Great City Schools this year. There were 10 nominees across the whole nation, and he was one. So my last question is right from my heart, Dorsey. I want to know, in the last week, can you tell us about something that made you the happiest?
Probably, I'm just trying to think about, probably my youngest daughter was so excited about a project that she had done and really thought that she was not going to do as well on it as she did, and ended up getting an A. You know, I think that honestly, you know, my kids, you know, who don't get enough dad time because of all the stuff that I do, are really the, you know, joy of my life. And just, I mean, again, I'm so incredibly blessed, because I could probably give you, even despite all the crazy stuff that happens all the time, I mean, I'm so filled with happiness and so filled with joy, and a lot of it's because of them.
Are there questions from the floor? I'll bring the microphone around.
I do have a daughter who has been in the public school system teaching for 12 years, and I have a story to tell. When she was at Fraser Elementary on Dillwood, she made on her own time to go and monitor breakfast, because it's very important. We all know that. And there was this little girl, some days she will devour everything, and some days she will not eat even a bite. And she asked her, "How come you're not eating, sweetheart?" She said, "It's not my day to eat, it's my brother's day." So all of you need to hear that story. And by the time they walk to school, she has volunteers that cut the bushes to give the walkway to the kids, because and there was an accident of a child on the street being hit. So there are a lot of good teachers that they give a lot of their time to make the kids safe, healthy environment. So I thank you for that. And she was acknowledged by her principal, because when that principal moved to another school, she took my daughter with her. So thank you for being here. And you have a lovely lady.
Other questions? Barbara?
How has it worked out for the teachers in the state, since they no longer can bargain?
So that's a great question. So they can't really, they don't have any bargaining rights. They have what's called conferencing rights. And so we still have to sit down and talk things out. But what's different is now, if we decide, if the board decides they don't want to do something, they don't have to do it now. What I will say is that nothing has really changed except the pay scale we talked about, because our board has really supported teachers and supported their right to negotiate. So I don't think there's been a huge impact with the Shelby County schools, but I think it has had a big impact in different districts throughout the state.
Any other questions? Charlton? Dorsey, Charlton is the leader of our Team Read program.
I have two questions. One, how effective is the Team Read program? Are you familiar with it, and is it a good use of our resources?
I think when you're dealing with the strategies around the sight words and things like that, and just the time that you all spend with kids who would normally not be doing that, it's great. I think also as a way to rally community and volunteers and get them in schools is great. What I'd like to see, kind of moving forward, is how do we think about you know, being able to maybe get a little more granular in terms of some of the literacy instruction, because you've got the kids for a certain amount of time. Like, you know, is there a way to start to deal with some of the decoding and the phonemic awareness and some of the other literacy strategies as opposed to just the sight words. Now, what I don't know is, I don't know whether, you know, that can even fit within the model we have now, and if, as we say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I do think more about, like, you know, it's such a powerful program, it's such a powerful impact, that is there a way to even do more around the fundamentals of literacy?
Follow up from Charlton.
If I'm a parent and have a child in an unperforming school, what options does that parent have to send their child to a different school?
No, that's a great question. So the district has what's called choice transfer. So, you know, any kid can go to any school if there's space. The challenge sometimes becomes transportation. And then we also have our optional program, too, similar process. And then we have, you know, any kid can go to any charter school as long as there's space too.
Hi, my name is Paula. How does your expectation prior to becoming the superintendent compare to the reality of actually being the superintendent? And I'll tell your mama because I'm a friend of hers.
I think that there's nothing that could have prepared me for what I got when I got the seat. And I think it just quick. So like interestingly, when they asked me to be the interim for the Memphis City Schools, it was supposed to be a 6-month deal, right? Like we were merging, Memphis City Schools was winding down. You know, we thought that they thought they knew who the long-term superintendent was going to be. So Dorsey, can you know, do this for 6 months? And I said, well, are you going to pay me the salary for 6 months? If you're going to do that, I'll do it. And so, you know, obviously my lens was much different then than now. And so I think that a lot of things that I thought, you know, were affirmed. I know we have extraordinary teachers, extraordinary school leaders. I know there are a lot of committed people. But I also know there's a lot of poverty, and I think I did not really truly understand the impact of that on instructional strategies, social emotional strategies, and how it impacts student outcomes. And then I think too, you know, I probably didn't realize how much, you know, political stuff, you know, went with this job, whether it's dealing with the legislature and kind of some of the plans that they had for Memphis, or dealing with the county commission at the time, the city council. So it's definitely been a huge learning, and I mean, a lot of things were affirmed, but there are a lot of things I had no idea.
I wanted to comment, this is the Thanksgiving season, so I'll tell you what we're grateful for. And that's the rock star teachers, because we have the benefit of some.
Yeah.
And I wanted to tell everybody what they look like. Our older daughter is on the debate team, and they had a debate Friday night. She was due there at 4:30. We got out of there at Cape Bond Middle School after 11. There were probably 10 schools represented. Each of those had teachers. There were probably twice or 3 times as many other teachers not involved that were judges. That's on top of a full school day. That to me looks like about a 16 or 17-hour day. She also is in the All West Honor Choir, which involved 3 hours of practice on Thursday night. They showed up at the Cannon Center yesterday morning at 8, and those folks left about 5. So that's a full day of work on top of a week. We've got teachers, the younger daughter has a classmate who has a pumpkin carving contest, pumpkin carving party for kids and parents. There were 5 teachers from their school at that party for 4 hours on a Saturday. I mean, these teachers are putting in long, long hours, and it's always amazing to us when we show up to these things and the teachers are there for hours and hours. That's what we're grateful for, and I wanted to tell their boss.
I'm grateful for that too, my friend.